I've done lazy world building, I've done lazy fantasy and sci-fi races, and I've done some horror videos. It's only natural that the concepts of laziness and horror should meet, as they very, very often do, as all fans of the genre know. I've been on a bit of a horror binge for the past year-ish, and since I'm probably going to start a second novel project soon-ish, that is horror-based, you may see a bit more of that sort of content on the channel coming soon. Fantasy-oriented stuff isn't going away, I may just be doing a bit more of this. In any case, this video will be a discussion we're going to break down based on how the horror genre handles certain aspects of story elements that are common to horror stories. I'll give examples of them done poorly and done well because I always want to have a positive spin on things. But we're going to waste no time and start with a classic horror concept that can actually be done well, but one of the most infamous to be done poorly, and that's part 1, buckets of blood. I'm about to activate a CIA sleeper agent code in a few of you with the following phrase: hyper-realistic blood. Yeah, you know where this is going. This is the best topic within horror to start with because it traces back to a fundamental flaw of what horror even is to some people. Mostly young people. To a lot of young people, horror is the difference between T and M on the ESRB rating of a video game box, or PG-13 and R on the parental advisory for a movie. How do you make that jump as quickly as possible when you're an edgy middle schooler writing a scary story? That good old phrase, hyper-realistic blood. If you have no idea what I'm talking about, that means you're either well-adjusted or this simply wasn't a feature of your adolescence. So let me catch you up real quick. When my generation was in middle to high school, creepypastas, internet stories of varying quality that were written online were a big thing. A prevalent trope with them was to take some completely innocuous IP, like SpongeBob, you know, the walking, talking sea sponge, and then make it dark and edgy and scary. Thus things like Squidward's Suicide were born, a story about some forbidden copy of an episode of SpongeBob that features characters offing themselves and all sorts of descriptions of blood and gore. It's very, very silly. But it was from that one in particular story that the sentence, "the blood was also done in a hyper-realistic style," was born, and thus the term hyper-realistic blood was coined, which would go on to be parroted completely straight-faced in countless other stories. And it became symbolic of the gratuitous nature of creepypastas substituting, you know, overwhelming violence for substance because, you know, these were written by teenagers who don't know how to write stories yet. I could have made the lazy end of this section be about all the countless slashers in which a paper cut exsanguinates 5 whales worth of blood from an 80-pound high schooler, but honestly, there really couldn't be anything else that would be as amusing to talk about in this section. As silly as that all was, blood can actually obviously be effectively used for dramatic effect. I would argue John Carpenter's The Thing is one of the best examples. I could have said of that, but it's just one of the best examples of many things. It's an excellent movie. It isn't the first time I've talked about it, and it will not be the last. However, our focus right now is that it is a pretty gory movie, especially as The Thing finally takes over each respective dog and or person, and especially in those times we see it as that sort of flesh amalgam of multiple beings at once. It's pure gratuitous gore and shock factor and whatever else you want to call it. But dang if it isn't skillfully done and quite effective. Something about knowing its practical effects too, that those objects really existed, it's not computer generated, makes it even more effective. It gives it that real uncanny vibe that you can't replicate otherwise. However, it's also great because it's concentrated. There are extended durations of calm, of tension, of waiting for the next horrible thing to happen. We might have the idea that MacReady is our main guy, so he'll probably make it. But we have no idea who else might survive, or who's going to turn next, or where the thing is going to come from, or when or if the guy they left in the shed is going to turn. When we do next witness this horror, the use of this grotesquerie means that the blood, the gore, and the appearance of these creatures never becomes mundane. If this thing had, say, 3 times the runtime that it did, it'd be lucky to have 1/3 of the effect. We can follow this into a related topic, which is part 2, shock value. Shock value and buckets of blood naturally follow each other. They're very similar concepts and are sometimes one and the same. But shock value is broader, as you might expect. It defines those moments within a story that are done really just to take the audience aback, to make them really feel something. Horror not always just in the sense of being scared, but even disgusted or angry. Shock value is a term we very often hear in an almost exclusively negative context, because when used in lazy ways, it becomes very egregious and it can really piss people off. And that's because it's often not hard to tell when shock value is being used to try and get cheap reactions out of people, when it isn't done to further the plot or enhance some further effect of something else, but just to make the audience feel something at all in what would otherwise be a gray, formless gruel of a story. The horror genre, more than any other, is probably guilty of doing things for shock value the most, because the feelings inflicted by shock value is a distant relative to those inflicted by horror itself, even if they exist in different contexts and for different reasons. But that relative similarity leads some to think that they can replace good horror with simple shock value, and that they'll achieve the same result, no strings attached. This does not happen, and I have a good example. Antlers is a movie that in many places was almost pretty good. Right off the bat, I'll give it, for me at least, like a 6 out of 10, and that's grading on a scale where 5 is considered watchable. The movie centers on a Wendigo curse that is passed on to a meth lab running father and one of his 2 sons. The older son is identified as troubled by a watchful teacher who tries to find out why this boy is acting so strange and distant, and in her endeavors to help him, she ends up uncovering the curse and does end up saving him from it. That part of the movie is pretty nice, and a lot of the character work is solid. The Wendigo creature that the crack father turns into looks really good, but there are 3 moments of shock value in the movie that didn't work for me for 3 slightly separate reasons. None of them are the sole reason that the movie's only a 6 out of 10 for me, but they are definitely big contributors. In any case, the first is that the older boy's school bully gets brutally eviscerated by the Wendigo. Now, I don't think the movie was trying to say that the bully deserved it, but still, being a bully does not justify death by mythological creature. More than anything, though, it felt like a kill to show off the Wendigo and be scary, and the bully kid was a shocking, taboo target to choose. The second instance of shock value was that the littler brother has to get killed by the teacher towards the climax of the movie because the curse passed on to him as well. This wasn't unforeseen, and it felt like it kind of almost worked, but I couldn't get over the feeling that saving him in some way and breaking the curse could have been more narratively satisfying, just because it is hard to overcome the burden of expectation that watching your protagonist stab a child to death isn't just shock value, especially because throughout the movie, it really defeats any sort of like positivity to the ending, because I mean, they just kind of forget about him at the end. It's like, we've got this nice happy family back together. Yeah, sorry I had to stab your little brother to death. I don't know, maybe I'm not remembering it perfectly, but that's how it came off to me. But the last instance of shock value was that at the end, we get that kind of happy ending I was talking about, with the teacher, the older surviving brother, and the teacher's brother, the sheriff of this town that they're in, who was pretty instrumental in helping out the whole time. I just didn't mention them yet because I don't remember their names, so I'm trying to keep it not that complicated. And the last shot of the movie is that cop, that sheriff, coughing up the Wendigo bile because, ooh, we're ending the movie with him having the curse, ooh. Maybe it's just me, but I hate this. I hate these endings. While I do think it's more fair to rate the movie still as a 6 out of 10, even despite this, my feelings on it probably would have been maybe up to a 7 out of 10 without this, but this made it feel like a 3 out of 10. There are 387.44 million miles of printed circuits and wafer-thin layers that fill my complex. If the word hate was engraved on each nano-angstrom of those hundreds of millions of miles, it would not equal 1/1000th of the hate I feel for these kinds of endings at this micro instant. So that itself is actually the point of the shock value section. It's those endings. They're rug pulls for rug pulls' sake. I have heard some interpretations that somehow that lends to the whole don't give up hope on the people you care about theme of the movie, and I would have agreed if it was just the sort of nebulous implication that maybe the surviving older brother of the kid that got poked might have turned later on, but the sheriff thing just because why not, was a bridge too far for yours truly. Once again, I know it made sense. It was just didn't work for me. Anyway, if you want to do it well, though in a bit more of a PG-13 way, I'll admit, we'll look to the X-Files, because I'll take any excuse to do that, because now that I'm rewatching it with my girlfriend, I'm being reminded that it may just be my favorite piece of media. If my better judgment ever leaves me, I will eventually make a multi-part retrospective on the show one day. But in any case, during Season 1, Episode 5's Shadows, we're presented with our first ghostly episode. All you really need to know is that the CEO of a company died recently in an apparent suicide, and his secretary is really going through it. And that's because her boss was like a father to her. When misfortune starts to befall her, she finds herself protected by a mysterious benefactor, most notably when 2 assailants end up dead after trying to mug her. Thus, Scully and Mulder go to investigate. Weird stuff happens the first time around, and as they leave, their car's brakes stop working and they get into a car accident. Further oddities ensue, but as they start uncovering more and more about the case, they figure out that the secretary is in danger. There's a moment of shock value just before and one just after. The former is when, in the night, the secretary is woken up by what seems to be an intruder, but it turns out to be the ghost of her boss, showing her how he died, including leading her to the bathtub, which he fills with blood in a really cool effect, especially for 1993, which reveals that he was, in fact, murdered. He didn't do it to himself. This was a pretty purposeful use of something that was weird and kind of spooky, especially because the show has been pretty tame so far, and that is furthered by what we see next. After that, we have this moment where our favorite feds realize the secretary's in danger, but they arrive to see her would-be assailants strangled on the ground, or one of them anyway. One of them is having his neck broken mid-air in a pretty grotesque, if not gory, scene, and a pretty wonderfully cinematic shot to boot. It's great stuff. These are both surprising and violent, especially by the precedent of what we've seen in the show so far, since we've only had a few episodes. So you could argue they were sort of done for shock value, but they also positively lend to the plot, and they're interesting. Anyway, that leads into our third topic, Part 3, Jump Scares. What would a lazy horror writing video be without talking about jump scares? Everyone knows them and everyone has an opinion on them if they've played more than one horror game. Given that fact, I'll give my own opinion to contextualize what I'm about to say. I like jump scares well enough. I like the feeling of dread a lot more as a source of horror, but a good jump scare can get me now and again, though they tend not to in games that are built around jump scares, with the exception of FNAF VR. That game is something else. Those robots are too big. But now that I've given that opinion, I can explain how the rest of this section will work because it's a little different. You might be expecting me to say, FNAF bad, many jump scare. Other game good, few jump scare. And while I am going to use a game that isn't jump scare based as my good example of the trope, I do have something to say in the defense of jump scare games. Has that word lost meaning yet? It probably will before the section's out. But what that defense is that good jump scare games rely on things other than just those to be good. The difference between FNAF 1 and Garten of Banban, which if you don't know what that game is, that's probably a good thing, is that the atmosphere of this dilapidated dark pizza restaurant is kind of creepy. The atmosphere of this UE5 asset flip is not. Thus, FNAF 1 can be scary to people, and Banban is scary to children. In any case, in FNAF 1, the jump scares are the climax of the horror, but the build-up is done by the audio cues, the creepy character designs, and the effort put into the atmosphere, which isn't there in that other game. So even in jump scare based games, they can still be done well. I'm kind of surprised though that I'm even coming to FNAF's defense. I'm not a FNAF guy, but here we are. Anyway, for my actual good use of jump scares example, Silent Hill 1, which is underappreciated in the Silent Hill series from what I hear. I've only just gotten into them, relatively speaking. There are only a few jump scares in the game, but there's one in particular I want to talk about because it got me really bad. But to me, it was brilliant because I knew it was coming. The best antidote against a jump scare is to know it was coming. But it subverted me just enough to get me anyway. So one of the areas in the game is an elementary school. You go through it in its normal form early in the game, and one of the rooms has lockers. You hear knocking in one of them, check it out because you're worried about what's inside. Oh, it's a cat, whatever. However, many areas in this game have an otherworld version where everything is rust and chains and blood. So you go around this area the second time in the otherworld version, and I saw the locker room on my map, and before I even got there, I was like, yeah, I bet there's going to be something in there that's going to try and get me. I'm ready for it. So I go in, hear the knocking, and I'm like, yeah, right. I open the door, nothing's inside, and I'm like, huh, bet something will be at the door I just came through then. I take a step, nope, locker behind me actually, and I sure did yell. That's a good jump scare. On to a topic that really should make its own video, Part 4, horror characters. I've touched on these before in my first horror writing video, and while I'm a year's worth of horror binging more qualified to discuss the genre than I was then, I'd say it still has value. So I'm going to focus on a key factor here and something that bad or lazy horror stories don't really do very well, which is making their characters likable. One of those ways that this ends up turning out wrong circles back around to being demonstrated by creepypastas, because one of the key flaws of creepypastas would end up being here. These novice writers would sort of take for granted that their characters would be likable, because in all likelihood they were essentially self-inserts, and thus they would write pretty insufferable people. I only say this so bluntly because I was guilty of writing the same thing, as is basically everyone who started writing stories as an equally insufferable teenager. But for some more fun examples in a more specific sense, a protagonist I consider particularly weak in a movie otherwise considered classic would be Larry Talbot from the 1941 The Wolfman movie. A reviewer on Google summarizes why this protagonist sucks pretty well. He spies on a lady with a telescope. Then he later approaches her for a date and is telling her details about herself that he shouldn't know, especially since they've never met before. And after creeping her out, he withholds how he knows this info unless she goes on a date with him. Smooth. Also, after she repeatedly turns down his advances, I'd say she's got a pretty good reason why she should say no, she finally reveals that she's engaged to be married. So what does Gentleman Lon do? He continues to hit on her even after meeting her fiancé. What a terrific guy. Why would I not want anything bad to happen to him? I get that it was 1941 and the standards were different or whatever, but despite how talented the cast was and how good the movie looked for its time, I could not get over how much of a sleazebag this guy was for the movie's duration. So when he died at the end, I was not upset. But the point that I'm making with both the creepypasta characters, which are obviously going to bad, and then this classic character, which is bad, is that a lot of lazy horror characters end up getting this idea, or lazy horror story writers get this idea, that because their character is going through a bad scenario, we are automatically going to feel sympathy for them just because the situation they're in is bad. But that isn't inherently the case. If they still suck, I'm not going to care. They still have to be a likable person. So, if we want to see why that's the case, we can look to what may be an odd pick, which would be the 2005 War of the Worlds movie, which I thought was going to be kind of bad, but turned out to actually be kind of good. And yeah, you could argue it's more of a sci-fi movie, more of a disaster movie, but also look at this shot. But I'd call it like an 8 out of 10. I think that's fair. And it's held up by a lot of the really great character work and the dynamic between the father, daughter, and son. The way that at first the father, as Tom Cruise, really does seem to be this absolute deadbeat loser, yet we do get these hints of competence and establish this connection between the siblings and the wall they've put up between themselves and their father. And then we watch all these get tested at once as the movie progresses. It all just works really well. More or less, the fact that the common family dynamic that you'd expect of everyone loving each other is flipped on its head for the incredible horror show they're put through. And it made things really interesting. Each of their personalities are put on show. The father's very flawed, but he's good at what he does in these kinds of situations, and he really cares about keeping his kids alive, even for how many ways that he sucks. The daughter defies expectations by not doing the stupid things that kids annoyingly get people killed by doing in horror movies, and the brother is torn between his desire to protect his sister and take the fight to the alien threat. This summary is doing it a disservice. The movie is, now that I'm thinking about it, it really is pretty good. You should watch it. They have these great moments, particularly around the time they're taking their car through a crowd of human survivors that abuse them worse than the aliens had up to that point. and they afterward just sit silently in a restaurant as people kill each other over their car outside. There's plenty more to be said about good horror characters, but I put the focus on likability here because the main job of a horror protagonist is to make you want them to survive. If they don't accomplish that, the story's ability to impart horror upon you is going to be very limited. If Genghis Khan was getting chased around by Bigfoot in a horror movie, I must say, I would have a very difficult time being scared on the Kill Street King's behalf. And honestly, with that, I think we've done a fair overview of lazy horror writing. There's tons more to say, but this'll do for now. I hope you enjoyed the video. If you have any thoughts of your own about this, I read every comment and would love to see them. In addition, every like and subscription goes a very long way. We also have a Discord if you want to hang out with my editor and I, and a Patreon if you're crazy enough to want it, where we post all our videos a week early. On that note, I'd like to thank our patrons, Shadowrunner, Sawney, and Isaac Parrott, our Knights of the Inner Circle, and Greer, our loyal squire. I hope you enjoyed, and remember, if you end your horror story like Antlers did, I will find you, and I will bring a comically large red pen.